All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ticknor Society's annual show and tell. I'm Dale Stinchcomb, and we've got a full program in store for you tonight. Before we jump in, I did want to say thank you to Mary Warneman, our president, and Sharon Struple, our vice president, for organizing tonight's event, and really for organizing all of our programs, the virtual programs this season. They've really been great. I know this is really not what we had planned, but it's turned out really well. One programming note just at the start, on Thursday, January 28th, 2021, calligrapher and book artist Marianne Greben's team will be offering an in-depth look at a contemporary manuscript of Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol. Her unique work is based on the original manuscript at the Morgan Library and contains nearly 30,000 words across 143 hand-lettered pages, 21 of which are decorated in a style reminiscent of medieval and Renaissance illuminated manuscripts. So if you haven't registered for that event and you'd like to, I am going to drop the link in the chat. So you can do that now. Of course, I'm delighted to introduce 5 members who you'll hear from shortly who've agreed to, as we were already pointing out, submit their backgrounds to public scrutiny. So if you want to take a look at their bookcases, but of course they've also agreed to share with us their own personal collections. Phoebe Bean, John Hemenway, G. Maguire, George Murphy, and Tim Weiskel will each talk for 10 minutes about their collections. That's right. You each have just 10 minutes, so you'll have to forgive me ahead of time for being a rather ruthless timekeeper. But I'm pretty sure that's why Mary picked me, because I'm so intimidating. And I will ask that you hold all your questions until the very end. And I know that's a lot to ask, especially if your mind is a sieve like mine tends to be. So if you want to drop your questions in the chat as they occur to you, feel free to do that. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the night, and we'll circle back to those questions during the Q&A to follow.
Dale?
So, yes.
Did you say you put something in the chat? I don't see anything. Was it just me?
Oh, yeah, it's because I didn't send it to everyone. I sent it to everyone in the waiting room.
Oh.
A lot of good that did, since there's no one in the waiting room. I didn't even know that was an option.
There you go.
Thanks, Alan. All right, Phoebe, without further ado, the screen is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's see if I can do this seamlessly. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to speak. I am the librarian at the Rhode Island Historical Society, so I'm way down here in Rhode Island. But this is one of my favorite topics, and I thought this would be of interest to the Ticknor Society. So Anne Franklin was a Boston girl. She was born in 1696 when Boston was going through the smallpox epidemics of the early 1700s. She met up at some point with James Franklin in Boston, and he was jailed in 1722, probably jailed a couple times, but the most important one was when he was jailed for suggesting that the Massachusetts legislature was colluding with Newport pirates. But he was also very involved in the debate over inoculation, and used the New England Courant, his newspaper, to voice his opinions. Even though he had been in prison, Anne marries him, so she knows what she's getting into. Younger brother Benjamin was apprenticed, or an indentured servant actually, to James until he ran away to Philadelphia in 1723. So that would have been when Anne was in the house. They finally decide to move or get chased out of Boston in 1727 and move to Newport. So her style is this is an imprint from around 1730. So while James Franklin was still alive, but Howard Chapin in his bibliography of broadsides, Rhode Island broadsides, attributes this to her and her nimble hands. She had 2 daughters, 5 children in total. 2 of the daughters survived and are known to have helped her with the business. So this is just the progression of the press. When they were in Boston, they moved down to Newport for 1727 to 1735, and then James Franklin promptly dies and leaves her with 5 children and a printing press. So what we're going to look at is a few imprints from that period where she was printing on her own or with the help of her family, from 1735 to 1748. And everybody always wants to know about Ben. You know, everybody loves Ben, and as a Rhode Island librarian, I have to beat the drum for James Franklin and Anne Franklin, I find. But even though Ben had run off and they had had a tumultuous relationship, the family connection was there for the rest of their lives. Ben was in Philadelphia. He did take James Jr. as an apprentice, and also, I believe, purchased type for her while in his trips to London. So you can, by going through the ornaments that she was using, and we can determine that 9 new ornaments were introduced during her tenure, and she added 2 typefaces. These are 2 of her earliest imprints. He dies in 1735, James Franklin. She published a lot of, here she doesn't have an imprint at all. But by 1736, she's starting to go by the widow Franklin. She was 39 when she was widowed, and she was the first editor of an almanac, and in America. So she took what she had and she ran with it. This is another one that I love. Serious and suitable counsels for them that go to sea, and for all that mind the good of their souls. In Newport, this would have been very popular because a lot of people were going to sea in Newport at that time. John Alden wrote the bibliography of Rhode Island imprints up till 1800. So you'll see, we refer to these as Alden numbers. So Alden 46, you'll see there in the bottom. But this was 1738. This is an incredible feat of printing that she performed in 1741. It's actually a survey of Narragansett Bay that was ordered by King George, but it's in verse. So 3 columns of verse describing the environment and the details of the bay. But you can see how this is reminiscent of the Perpetual Almanac that we looked at earlier. She was also the printer to the colony of Rhode Island. She printed currency. She printed proxies or absentee ballots. We call them proxies in Rhode Island. Her husband, when he became the colonial printer for the brief period that he was alive, printing in Rhode Island, received a yearly stipend, although Anne petitioned for one. I've heard conflicting reports, but I'm pretty sure that she did not receive a stipend. She just was paid by the job. So she was a businesswoman. And she produced this large folio. This was her biggest work. The beautiful colonial seal of Rhode Island is there with hope. And I believe that my suspicion is that James Franklin engraved that. But we can't be sure. But she printed extras apparently without permission, and the General Assembly put a $5 fine on any copy she sold a year after the date of the meeting. So shows that she was ambitious. And just to finish up, to show a little bit of how she was honored in the community, this is also from our collection in the Rhode Island Historical Society, but this is from Ezra Stiles' Schedule of Mortality. And you can see there that she's listed as Widow Franklin, printer, at age 68 when she passed away, outliving all of her children. And then this is her obituary, and printers will recognize the traditional mourning borders. And this was written probably by her partner, Samuel Hall, who took over the Newport Mercury, which they had founded together. And that leaves me with 2 minutes to go, but I think I'm done.
Thank you, Phoebe. We agreed to go in boring alphabetical order. So John, that means you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Just to give me a moment, I have to navigate to the album.
Certainly.
Okay, making progress. Almost there. Okay. Here we go. My name is John Hemenway. I live in Boston. I live near Boston Common. I'm a bibliophile, but I have no academic or professional qualifications whatsoever. But one day, a couple of years ago, I stumbled across the most obscure thing you could possibly find, I think, in the form of this journal and this article in this journal. The journal is 1955. The article that interested me is the first one in the contents there, Howland Island, its birds and rats, as observed by a certain Mr. Stetson in 1854. And what this sort of, the format of the article is a short letter from Llewellyn Howland to this scientific journal saying, hey, look, guys, here's a very interesting letter I found in the files of my very old New Bedford whaling company. And his letter is maybe 1-page introduction, and then there's maybe a 15-page missive that follows that. And what it was the Howland people acquired a very remote Pacific island in the 1850s, and at some point sent out this Mr. Stetson to tell them what they had bought. So this is the sort of the story of his visit to Howland Island. This journal sort of, I love this sort of typical science journal format that, you know, we've seen it before. So where's Howland Island? It is very far away. It is really as far away from here as you can possibly get. That's the international date line just to the left of Howland Island. There's Hawaii up to the, just to the upper right. You can see a tiny, tiny little thing there. The Howland Island's greatest notoriety probably was as the airstrip that Amelia Earhart was attempting to reach but never did when she was lost. It's tiny. It's about 2 miles long and half a mile wide. There's no people there. There are no trees there. This is a satellite view from the top. It's incredible. It's really at the tippy top peak of a 12,000 foot underwater mountain. So its levels is about 5 feet above sea level, but there's 12,000 feet that go down below it. This is significant to the story because it is so steep a drop off that ships are unable to anchor there. So Stetson's ship arrives and they drop their anchor and all it does is dangle in water. It doesn't reach the bottom. So what happened was Stetson was dropped off by the ship. The weather, winds or something turned, the ship had to go away from shore, and Stetson and his 2 companions were left on the island for 2 nights, 3 days, 2 nights. The horror of the story, which is kind of a mixture of Melville and Edgar Allan Poe, is that, as Stetson describes it, the island was inhabited with millions and millions of birds, these seabirds, boobies, brown-footed and red-footed boobies, and surviving on the eggs that they would lay in their nests, millions and millions of rats. So it's a story about Stetson's battling the rats, fighting off the rats for 3 days, his horror to discover that the more rats he killed, the more the other rats were attracted to him, and it's just an amazing story. But I decided that such an amazing story deserved to live in some more permanent place in a PDF file of a 1955 science journal. So my little project was to put it in a more physical context. So that's what I did. So I just, should this thing look like? This is a digitized image of the actual logbook of the vessel Rousseau, which was the vessel that took Stetson in 1855 to go see the place. So that's a starting point. That's what my thing might look like. Then, sort of generic logbook sort of thing. This is Noel and Howland, the 1955 family member who provided this thing to the journal. This is his composition book, so it had a nice label on it that I thought might do for my project. And then what could I do to make it sort of stand out? What could I do to make it sing? Well, I decided to use exotic binding material. Here's my tanning formula. So it's bound, I'll show you the finished product later. It's bound in rat. So this is the pelt of the rat. There's no way you can get rat. You cannot buy rat leather. I looked, believe me, for months. So the only way to do it, the only way possible was I had to do it myself. So I had to find some and make some rat leather. So rats are actually very popular food for reptiles. So you can get, there's bred rats, commercially bred rats, and you can buy them in certain pet stores that cater to snakes and things like that, and they feed the snakes. So that was the source of the rats. That was desirable because you'd never want to use a city rat. Who knows what sort of diseases are there, but these were commercially bred and frozen, so that was nice. So I'm going to ask you, brace yourself, because the next picture is kind of, graphic, but it's the first stage of the process of making leather. Oops, excuse me. So here we are. You have to skin the rat, so that's what happens. Got to remove the hair. Basically, you remove it by soaking it in water. At least that's what I did. And then you just rub it off with your thumbs. Whoops, doing too fast. Comes off rather nicely. Then tan it using my tanning. It was basically a taxidermist's or deerskin tanning thing, which I bought through the internet. It's supposedly vegetable tanning and not chromium. I don't know. I called Minnesota. It's a sort of outfit where you call and they say, you expect them to say XYZ tanning company. Instead, they say hello. So here's the tanned, one of the tanned ones. Takes a lot of rubbing to get it smooth and supple. That's not blood, that's dyeing. Then the creation of the book. I didn't actually do this. A person named Allie Rosenthal did it for me. She was a one-year intern, graduate of the North Bennett Street School, and a intern, or a fellow, I should say, one-year fellow at the Boston Athenaeum. And I hired her to do this little project, and which she did very competently and nicely. And so there's the final product, or at least the outside of it. You'll remember the label, sort of the logbook format. The only real embellishment on the outside are the teeth in the corners, and then a few little items inside. The end papers are sort of from an atlas. If I can do this properly, I hope you should see Howland Island there, just to the right of the international date line. Oops. This is the Howland Company private signal. So that was the ship, the flag that flew on the ship Rousseau. This is a little directory of company flags that's in the possession of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. You see the Rousseau listed as the last item there, Howland family. There it is again. That's a booby foot, brown booby foot, which I put there. This was sort of my final conceit. It's sort of a mock library book with I had to sort of reverse engineer using the Cutter catalog system, reverse engineer a number for it and a card that's on the back end paper. And there it is, and that's the project. Okay, I think I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Wow, I don't know how we talked for 30 minutes and I didn't realize that you were going to show a rat binding today. That's crazy.
I must say that the story of the binding itself is about 5% of the whole story. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much that goes with this Howland Island with the whole story, but that's for another day.
We'll have time for some questions. We're doing good on time. So next, Jean, are you ready? Jean Maguire?
I'm ready. I don't know
All
how
right.
I follow that exactly. Wow, John, I did not see that coming. So, I will say, I think it's very appropriate that I'm following birds and rats. I think not only was I born in the year of the rat, but the books I've chosen to share tonight are from a collection of nature books. And that collection belongs to me and my husband, Todd. It's not our only book collection, but it's one of our favorites, and I've cataloged quite a bit of it. So for both of those reasons, I chose it for tonight. So how did it start? Todd and I both collected nature books before we met, and now it's been a joint effort for 25 years. And it's a combination of two great interests of ours, books and nature, but it's driven primarily by the nature interest. So as far as goals for the collection go, it's first and foremost a working reference collection. Hardly a day goes by that we don't refer to it, especially as we need to identify a bird, a plant, an insect, what have you. But in terms of collecting purposes, it also has two other categories, I would say. Books that are appealing because of their design or an unusual historical characteristic, even though they may be out of date in terms of their information, and books that serve both purposes. So they have an attractive design or history and have information that's still useful. So for tonight's show and tell, I'm going to focus a little more on design and unusual or historical characteristics. I did not know we could use PowerPoints, so I'm very sorry to report that you were gonna have to look at my face, but occasionally I'm gonna put a book in front of my face. So there's that. The years of publication for the collection range from approximately the 1850s to 2018. The size of the collection is about 400 volumes. I've now cataloged 200 of them. So, you know, eventually someday I will finish, and there's still a little more work to be done there. The topics that are the most well covered in the collection are probably birds and shells. But just to throw you a curveball, I'm actually not going to show you any shell books tonight, and that's because I haven't cataloged them yet. So we won't be seeing those tonight. We acquire the books mostly by serendipity, in person at used bookshops. We've acquired a lot as we've traveled and have either needed a guide to that area's wildlife, or we're just shopping for used books in general. Most of what we buy is low or moderately priced. Our current collecting focus for the nature collection is limited to practical reference books that we're going to use, and that limit is simply because our house is full of books, and buying more means either building more shelves or deaccessioning books, and neither of those options is particularly appealing at the moment. So let's get into the examples. I think, and if you hear books go crashing, that's because I'm working with them here. Hopefully that won't happen. I think the earliest book in the collection is The Seaside and Aquarium, or Anecdote and Gossip on Marine Zoology by John Harper, published in Edinburgh in 1858. It has a nice gold-stamped front cover, a very detailed design on the spine, and much to my delight, it has a binder's ticket inside the back, which reads, bound by John Gray, Edinburgh. So according to the Royal Academy, Gray flourished between 1816 and 1860. Perhaps some of you have books that were bound by John Gray, so I'd love to hear from you. Many of the books in our nature collection have not book binder tickets, but bookseller tickets, especially from a variety of Boston booksellers. And I would have loved to have shown some of those tonight, but that's another talk, whole other talk, so we won't go there. We'll move on to the next item, which is an example of a book, or in this case, booklet, that's also an advertisement. This is Butterflies of America. It's from 1900, compliments of Chase and Sanborn, importers of tea and coffee in Boston, Chicago, and Montreal. And you could find this tea and coffee for sale, as we're told on the back, by F.L. Frank and Company in Bangor, Maine. And not only does it have attractive and actually very accurate illustrations inside, it has such wonderful period advertising language as verily, need my glasses, verily, the woman who can make a happy table for her husband is not only a housekeeper, she is a husband keeper as well. So get the right tea and coffee, folks. The next book, we have a few books on animal tracks and tracking, which are quite useful. This book is both useful and has a lovely cover design, I think. It was published by Outing Publishing Company of New York in 1912, kind of an arts and crafts cover design with 3 elements of birds and trees and fish, which are carried over to the spine. And so if you're looking to, track a bear or a lynx or otter, or just a skunk or squirrel in your backyard, that's your book. A book that I place in the category of just plain cool is Animal X-Rays by Brenda Putnam, published in 1947. It's not actual X-rays, but really illustrations of animal skeletons, but I think the cover is evocative of X-ray technology. And the book covers everything from anteater to warthog to pelican. And there's an example of the anteater. We collect several series of books, as you might expect with a nature collection. When we find a title that we like and it has good information, we like to get more from that series. Typically that's things like Peterson Field Guides or Audubon, something you might have heard of. But for tonight, I've chosen a more unusual one. And this is a series of government publications. And they were published by the US Department of Agriculture, a series of yearbooks. We have 4 of them from the late 1940s and early 50s. And we really like the modern post-war design of them. This one is insects, and this one is crops in peace and war. And while they're not published as popular reading material, they're addressed primarily to farmers. They're also addressed to consumers. And they have so many fascinating articles in them, like the making of potato chips, crops from maple trees, and perhaps one that's not so appetizing, quality and processed poultry. And it has some nice illustrations, including, hold on to your hat, woman as scientist in 1950 in a lab there. So who says the government doesn't get anything right? The next item is one of my favorites, and this is an example of an author-owned copy of a book. It's called Birds of Martha's Vineyard, first edition from 1959. And it's funny because it was marked as is on it by the bookseller, but as is the best thing about this book. So it's torn, you can see the jacket, it's been well used, but it was owned by one of the authors, in this case, Ludlow Griscom. And in the back, I discovered that because in the back it says, for my new records since book was completed, and it up here, and it refers to the pages. And so what Griscom did was, over the years after publishing this, went back and added to entries. For example, there's one here for, I just lost my page. There's one where it says, I saw it on such and such date, eating this certain kind of berry, or there's an entry for a screech owl, and he's actually made a note of when the screech owl died, the dates during which he thinks that happened, or when he later saw a Caspian tern and notes the date of a hurricane that happened right before he saw the tern. So it's really, there's newspaper clippings, which I copied so the acidic paper wouldn't be in there, but all kinds of great stuff. So that's really one of my favorites. I like finding that kind of stuff. Next is an example of a book chosen more for its design and for the history of its information, as opposed to having up-to-date information. And that's Popular Astronomy, published in 1907. I like the simple cover design of the stars. It has the Cassiopeia constellation on the spine. And it also has the book plate of Louis Agassiz Shaw. No, not the dreaded Louis Agassiz, infamous biologist, but his great-grandson, Louis Agassiz Shaw, Jr. I was able to determine that it was Junior and not Senior because Senior died before the book was published. Junior was an instructor of physiology at Harvard. It's a real Boston Brahmin family situation. His mother was a Saltonstall, and his Shaws were those of Civil War Colonel Robert Gould Shaw fame. And along the same lines, this is an example of a book that was definitely not chosen for the accuracy of its information, but in fact for the errors in its information. It's Mars by Percival Lowell, founder of the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, published by Houghton Mifflin in 1895. Lowell believed that Mars was covered with canals created by an intelligent civilization. So that was, of course, way off. The book has a beautiful cover design, I think, with this gorgeous font and a red cover for the red planet. And as a bonus, it has the charm of having been a prize for excellence in geometry given to A. Sprague Coolidge in 1909. So almost just a couple more items. The earliest acquisition is this one, which is an Audubon guide to all the birds of Eastern and Central North America from the 1950s, which was a gift from Todd's grandmother to him when he was 8 years old, because don't we all get 400-page reference books when we're 8 years old? He was very mature, 8 years old. It's not for children, but for adults. It's 2 volumes bound together, and it's still very well used today. And the second earliest acquisition is this Golden Nature Guide on Stars, also from the 1950s, which was given to Todd when he was about 10 or 12 by a friend of the family. And it has a spine repair that is not exactly up to code, so I hope my conservator friends are looking the other way. It has some wonderful color illustrations in it, like this of the sun. It's really charming and well worn. An example of a recent acquisition is Birds of Britain by J. Lewis Bonnote, published in 1907. I acquired this at the 2018 Boston International Book Fair from DeWolf and Wood Rare Books. We don't have a lot of books on British wildlife, especially because we haven't spent much time in Britain. So this was a nice addition, and I was certainly attracted to its cover and the fact that it's loaded with really fine illustrations like the English robin. Can't beat that. And lastly, no presentation on nature books would be complete without some natural specimens. We have a number of books that have some specimens inserted in them. Some of them are specimens we've collected, and some are specimens that came from past owners of books, such as this one. As mentioned before, we have a lot of these Peterson field guides. This one is on ferns, and who doesn't love fern specimens? Here is an example. I'm going to have to be very gentle with this, but hopefully you can see the specimen there. And the owner also made notes about where specimens were found. Like this one says, bank of brook at north end of lake. We don't know what the lake was. There's another one that says the ferns were found on the wall of the garage. So it's filled with specimens, and that's always lovely. And that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jean. That's wonderful. All right. George Murphy, you are here, right?
I am, Dale. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen and hope it works. Okay. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay, well, I'm going to talk tonight about something that I'm not a big collector of, actually tattered American imprints. I actually have a primary interest in early printing, European printing, 15th and early 16th century printing. But I thought it would be interesting to share with you an interest I've had over at least a decade now, maybe a little longer, and a passion to maybe someday write a non-medical book that has something to do with history and something to do with books, monograph, something maybe not a scholarly book necessarily, but something for the lay public. And so I want to talk about the price of books, tattered American imprints and the legacy of Richard Price. And I hope that next year we can do this in person so I can actually bring the books in. You know, the social distancing this year is problematic, but it's great that we have Zoom, and I think this meeting is really going in a very, very wonderful way. The story that I have to tell, and I'm going to try to do it as succinctly as possible, relates to the hometown I grew up in, which is Franklin, Massachusetts. And some of you may know that Franklin claims to have the first public library in the United States. And the reason why they claim that is because back in the 1780s, they requested from Benjamin Franklin, because they named their town after him, a bell for their town hall. And Franklin ostensibly said, sense is preferable to sound. This farming community doesn't need a bell. What they need is books. And so he sent them books, which now, which as a boy, when I was growing up, I would be in the Franklin Public Library and I would see this bookcase that you see there with the 116 or so books that was the Franklin gift to Franklin, Massachusetts, which they ostensibly formed the first public library with. And as I grew older and became a bibliophile and thought, gee, I would love to write something about book collecting and books and history. And I thought, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to write something about Benjamin Franklin and the role of books in his life? And so I started researching that. And I had been very fortunate in having a number of different venues allow me to see their very, very valuable material with supervision, of course. And so I simply wrote to the Franklin Public Library and said to them, can I possibly inventory the books and maybe help with some bibliographic documentation of what they're all about, because that had never been done. There was only a list of the titles. And unfortunately, I got this response back from the Franklin Public Library that the Library Board of Directors has considered your request, and we regret to inform you that there's no public access to the material due to their fragility and rarity. It's the symbolism of the books that's important. Handling the books themselves serves no purpose, since there is no evidence that Dr. Franklin ever came into contact with the books personally, as Dr. Franklin asked his friend, Dr. Price, to select a few good books. We wish you well. Well, that put a damper on things, obviously, but it made me start thinking about, okay, well, who is Dr. Price, and how did this all happen, and what were the, so this actually was a good thing for me, because it stimulated me not only to think about it, but actually it spawned a little mini collection in my library, and it's these tattered books here. And when people walk into the library, they say, what are those books about? And so I wanted to share with you what the common bond is among these books. And very briefly, I'll just show you, I'll take each one off the shelf virtually and show you. This is the earliest one. It's by Samuel Willard. It's of interest, and you can see the asterisk showing you which book it is. What's interesting is that he was the pastor of the Third Church of Boston, which was the church that Benjamin Franklin's parents were married in. Benjamin Franklin was baptized in and attended as a boy. So that book kind of belongs there. And there's the church. The next book, the next oldest book, is this one by John Flavel. John Flavel has a connection because Franklin's father's small library had a number of books by John Flavel, and apparently Franklin, as a younger man, when he was more religious than he became as a more secular person in later life, actually had an attraction to his writings, at least according to Thomas Coombs, who was a contemporary. You know, Phoebe has done the heavy lifting here. This is a book by James Franklin, 1722, perhaps a bad year for James, but of course, Benjamin Franklin was apprenticed to him and had a tremendous influence on Benjamin Franklin. And we have to remember the New England Courant. This is the mid-19th century reprinting on Franklin's press of the New England Courant that I'm showing you there. Of course, a few books by Benjamin Franklin himself would belong in the collection by Franklin and Hall. The book on the right, I actually think is kind of interesting because of the worming, and I always remember Franklin's epitaph, where he talked about his body being the food of worms, like the cover of an old book in his epitaph. So the wormhole has some significance there. And the book by the book on Thomas Chalkley, Dr. Thomas Chalkley, graduate of University of Pennsylvania, friend of Franklin, is interesting, and it just shows you how important it is to pick up a physical book and look at it to see how an early reader wanted to preserve a torn page. I guess Scotch tape wasn't very plentiful back at the time. And then, of course, we have to have a book by Price. Here's a book by Price, and a theologian who influenced him, Charles Chauncey. So there's one of those. So who was Richard Price? Well, he was a British intellectual and polymath. He was the minister of Newington Green Unitarian Church. He was a nonconformist preacher, a moral philosopher, a mathematician, an economist, a political activist, a pamphleteer, a book author, a pro-American and pro-French revolutionary, human and women's rights advocate, demographer, and fellow of the Royal Society. In fact, history has really forgotten about this man, but he was an extraordinarily talented individual. He was an advisor to Jefferson, to Priestley and others, and a close friend and confidant of Franklin. Now, did Franklin have anything to do really then, as Franklin Public Library would say? He didn't have much to do with these books. It was Price who gave the books to Franklin, Mass. But if you look at the list that the Franklin Public Library has, and you start looking at connections to Benjamin Franklin's own library, which we now can trace because we have his shelf mark that allows us to identify pieces of his dispersed library, we can see one after another in this list are books that were either in Franklin's library or that had a big effect on Franklin's life. Of course, there were Price's books that were also given to Franklin, Mass. As well. Another big influence here was Sister Jane Franklin. And if you, I would recommend Jill Lepore's, Harvard's own Jill Lepore's book to you, Book of Ages, on the life and opinions of Jane Franklin. She has sections in this about the profound, delicate, yet highly effective influence Jane had on Benjamin Franklin and Richard Price in terms of the books that were selected to give to Franklin, Mass. Well, who were the books given to? They were given to Nathaniel Emmons, the pastor of the Congregational Church in Franklin, Mass. He took the books, he eventually, this is a book here where he actually describes the gift of the books, and he took them and he liked them so much, he locked them up in his house and he didn't share them with anybody. They were under lock and key for 5 years. So the people of Franklin, the intent was to give them to the people of Franklin so that they could read them and become cultured, but that just didn't happen right away. He locked them away and kept them for himself. What about the books at the Franklin Library? Well, Jill Lepore tells us that the books were cleaned and conserved in 1997. However, to this day, the volumes remain displayed behind glass in a locked cabinet, and it is the library's policy that no one can open the books for any reason ever again, quote unquote, from Jill Lepore's book. This was Felicia Odie, library director, in an email to her. So to summarize, what I've done is I've thought about this in terms of this little collection of books, how they talk to each other, how they're interconnected. And there's a story to be told here that's kind of buzzing around in my head that I hope someday maybe to put together. You have Samuel Willard and John Flavel, the church Franklin went to, the books that were in his father's library having an influence on Franklin, Brother James having an influence on Franklin, Thomas Chalkley, his friend, having an influence on him, a big time influence from Sister Jane, books given to Richard Price, his good friend, who was influenced by Charles Chauncey, given to Emmons, okay? And these books all tell that story tangibly to me, and the story I think can be told. And the other part of the story is when you lock books away and you don't share them for scholarship, and that's a shame, really. But one of the people here who I think is underrated and needs to be talked about more is Richard Price, because it was Richard Price, not Franklin, who was the essential common pathway from multiple influences who, through his wisdom, led to the selection of the secular and religious required reading, going back to the Athenaeum, deemed essential for a farming community in need of sense more than sound. So someday, maybe I can come before this august group and share with you a book that I would like to write, but it's not going to be about Benjamin Franklin. It's going to be about Richard Price, and that's my dream. And this little collection of books has a little bit to do with that and inspires me in that direction. So thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I went a little bit over, but it's an area that I find really interesting.
George, thank you. I'm ashamed for my library colleagues, and I'm glad that you and Jill Lepore have shamed the Franklin Public Library. Maybe they'll one day get ashamed enough to actually open that cabinet.
They will eventually open them up, I hope.
All right, last but not least, Tim Weiskel.
Right.
Hey, Tim.
I'll try to share my screen if I'd learn how to do it in such a way that I can keep myself to 10 minutes and 22 seconds, because I put it on a video, lest I wax on too long. I get excited about these things, and I'm excited about all the previous presentations. I have lots of questions. So the question is this: I was a historian, I'm a historian, and trained as an anthropologist. And the question is, how did I get interested in old books? Well, here's how it started. The whole thing started, basically, innocently enough, with the purchase of a book, an old book. It was a travel book, whereas I found out more precisely when I opened it, it was one in a series of travel books entitled Histoire des Voyages. These things can start with individual travel accounts or encyclopedias filled with compilations of different travel accounts. This little book turned out to be both. It looked small enough, but in fact it opened up to a much wider world because it had fold-out maps and plans, which invited you to look at them. You can't, in fact, see a map without trying to situate yourself in relation to that map. It's kind of instinctual. We want to see things visually, but then also place ourselves in relationship to those scenes or drawings. Some of them are straightforward maps and have labels on them that you can read pretty easily. This is in French, so you know they're speaking of jardin, which means gardens. And it looks like the areas here have to do with constructed environments, human engineered fortresses that previously you learned were also part of the foldouts within this strange book. Then you got views from these kinds of fortresses from a distance. Very interesting. And you couldn't help but, again, figure out, okay, what's land, what's sea, what's the flag? In fact, you start asking questions immediately of these kinds of illustrated travel books. Well, you're reminded very quickly of The Doctor's Dream. This is a print from 1819, a book that appeared with illustrations by Thomas Rowlandson. Entitled, the whole series is entitled Tour of Dr. Syntax in Search of the Picturesque. Well, at some point, he sits down and starts to dream about different books that he's encountered. It's pretty extraordinary drawing, and it has a sort of a map in the background. It has a view of an area of London at the time that he has in mind. And all of these books are reminding him of different kinds of things, including controversies that are taking place between people who write books. And in his mind, they're all sort of fluttering around. It's fantastic pictorial representation of what goes on in people's minds in dreams, but also in open, awake time thought. You could take a look at these books and begin to drift off yourself. In fact, spewing page after page after the title page, especially when you find out that that's volume 13, and the maps just keep unfolding along with views of the castles that are constructed in the west coast of Africa, complete with their floor plans that you can look at in detail. Like this one from the Dutch fort at Shama. Now, if we go beyond Dr. Syntax and ask about the historian's dream, you could easily see that this is what goes on when any historian starts to drift off with books in his mind. A book historian dream even more so because they're thinking particularly of the different books that are flying around in the imagination and the controversies that are well illustrated here that might be involved in the writing of these different books. Well, of course, the historical print collector has a similar dream because these books contain prints. and those prints are often in controversy with one another, directly contradicting prints that appear in earlier editions, and none of them having anything to do with the print on the wall of the print collector, which happens to be a portion of London, looking over at the Cathedral of St. Paul's from the other side of the Thames. Well, all of this is, of course, related to the cartographer's dream, because inside of this book are lots of plans, diagrams, and maps. And when you turn to the cartographic historian's dream, well, you can see how complicated it gets very quickly, because each map has a history to it. And the question is, which ones come before other ones? If one comes before another one, is it copied? Or are they both copied from some other source? Well, the whole thing amounts to a bibliophile stream. Anybody who really loves books loves these kinds of ruminations. And of course, if you love books of this kind, you want to make sure that they're preserved. And you could say this represents a bookbinder's dream as well. But think on it a bit. Is it a bookbinder's dream or a bookbinder's nightmare? If you get to rebind these books because they're falling apart and you want to preserve them, that could be a nightmare. A real nightmare, unless you have some help. Well, you can read about how they used to bind these books in the 18th century, but it's much easier to learn from a master who knows about that. Someone like Sam Ellenport here in Boston. Rather than make mistakes on rebinding the book itself, Sam suggested that I start by making boxes to protect them. So I did this, making boxes, and you can see how they fit in, and they look nice to me, but Sam pointed out that they weren't acid-free, and what you need to do is make acid-free clamshells for the whole set of 18 volumes. And I say, well, how do you make a clamshell? And he says, watch. And he proceeds to show me how to make clamshells, and I make several attempts at doing it, usually with larger books, and eventually I get them to stand on their own. Eventually, then as well, I downsize the whole effort and make it work for smaller books. But perhaps you can help me with the end paper question. They don't match. This is faded. The new ones are bright. Well, I'm hoping you can help me with the end paper question, but beyond the end papers, there are many more questions I'm sure you can help me out with. Returning to the historian's dream, for example, there are a lot of enduring questions. Why were these volumes published in this form in the first place? In octavo form, not quarto form. What was the market for these travel books? Who bought them? What was the primary source material behind them? Who copied whom? Who drew these maps? The cartographer would ask. Who drew the maps in each of the volumes? Who provided the geographers with their raw material? Are there manuscript precursors to these published maps? If so, where are they? And by whom were they drawn? Above all, how accurate are these maps in these volumes for the times at which they were published? What is revealed in each of the maps, in fact, and what is left out? What is unrevealed? What is perhaps even hidden? Why are so many of the maps published in French and Dutch simultaneously with labels in both languages on the same page? Why were the Dutch cartographers so prominent in the 17th century and the French in the 18th century? What did the publication of these maps, scenes, and travel accounts have to do with the flourishing of the joint stock company, first in the Netherlands and then throughout Europe? Some new questions then have come from reading old books, especially when we look at imaging and imagining the agro-ecology and pathology of European empire. You can catch up with other aspects of it by scanning in the QR code and keeping in touch. Thanks to you all, and to all a good night. Okay. Well, that's what I have to share, but I've got more questions, as you can see, than I've got answers. So I'm hoping all of you book historians can help me out here.
Thank you, Tim. And thanks to all of our speakers for keeping to time. I didn't have to bring out my gong like I had expected I would have to. So we can get right to questions. We're a small enough group that I don't see any reason why you all shouldn't be able to unmute yourselves and ask your questions. If you had dropped a question in the chat earlier, feel free to give it some life and have someone respond to it again, just maybe for the record of for the recording at least, because remember, those who are viewing it afterwards won't see the chat. So thank you again to all of our speakers.
Well, I got to say that binding something in rat gives me a whole new dimension of thinking about this. Especially since in one of our tours years ago, we were given, I think it was in the library over at the Harvard Ethnographic Museum. We were shown a book that was bound in human skin, which is not inappropriate for the subject matter of what I'm reading about in the 18th century. That these are books about the slave trade, 18 volumes on the history of the slave trade, with these floor plans of the slaving castles and the like. I don't particularly want to go through the process of binding it in human skin, but the juxtaposition of culture and depravity in these things is pretty extraordinary.
It's true. The phrase embellished tooth embellishment, I think, is not something I often see in a binding description. Though, you know, Todd, Marie, others may have come across it much more. I hope that you have cataloged that, John.
I'd like to recommend a book to Phoebe, which she perhaps has already read, but I just finished a book called London in Chains. Have you read, by Gillian Bradshaw, it's historical fiction, but it's about a woman who becomes involved with an illegal printing press in London during the English Civil Wars in the 1600s. It was really good. And what I've heard from those who know, which not myself, but those who know, is that it's a very accurate representation of how a printing press and a print shop would have worked at the time. So.
What was the title again?
London in Chains.
London in Chains. Thank you.
For those who haven't been looking at the chat, Mary asked Phoebe earlier whether she collected early printed materials herself, to which she said she tries and that she has an almanac problem. Can you tell us a little bit about your almanacs, Phoebe?
Well, my great uncle was Rob Sagendorf, who started Yankee and revived the Farmer's Almanac. So I've always had an affinity for almanacs, and now that I get the opportunity to work with early colonial imprints, it's just fascinating. So I can't collect Rhode Island material in my current position because it's against ethics. But definitely any early almanacs that I've had before I was in my current position are still. But I have to stop myself. I mean, they come out every year, so you just have to like cut yourself off at some point.
I'm grateful though for your mentioning the personal connection, because there happens to be one in my case too. My mother's cousin was a fellow named Hans Zinzer, who wrote a book called Rats, Lice, and History, which is actually a fairly famous book in medical history. And it's he and his sensibilities that put me onto the whole question of early colonial encounters, where a lot of rats, lice, and other vermin were exchanged on colonial frontiers, that I'm beginning to investigate now with people like Frank Snowden, the medical historian down at Yale, who's been looking at the cartography of epidemiology. It gives us a whole new way of looking at the colonial frontier, and particularly the influence of people like George Washington, who was out on the West Virginia frontier creating maps and giving these grand ceremonial exchanges of guns and powder and furs and blankets. And here in Massachusetts itself, many of our venerable institutions like Williams College and Amherst College are named after people whose main distinction was that they killed French and Indians in the 7 Years' War, and before that in the colonial French and Indian Wars, and became famous for distributing smallpox in blankets. In other words, the first conscious attempt at biological warfare since Carthage.
Tim, this is Dorothy Africa. I remember from my active working career at the Harvard Law School, working on a number of books from the international collection that were early treaties. And they came with the most amazing maps, often hand-drawn by explorers or people who were involved, because of course the treaty means you have to get people to agree on the borders. And these were from places that became Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, and show these incredible depictions of where the local villages are, most of which I assume are long gone now, but features like mountains and lakes and rivers that could possibly still be connected to these early topographical descriptions. But one map I'm remembering that had me laughing for a good half hour. I can't, of course, now remember anything useful that would let you find it again, but it was a map of the Atlantic, the Old World and the New, particularly concerned with Latin America. But at the bottom, the cartographer had inserted or the designer had inserted and the printer had printed this tirade against the miserable map making of his predecessors and how unreliable they were and how they should all be ashamed of the work. It was quite amazing.
Well, Dorothy, thank you so much for that. We'll have to have a side conversation because you may not remember the maps, but you at least remember where they are.
Yeah, and a book in the library won't help you much to find them. I'm afraid all of those were long since sent off to remote storage, so the chances of anybody finding them again are somewhat, I hate to say, slight.
Well, I'll get on the case because that's exactly the thing that's needed to recover the manuscript material at the base of some of these printed maps. I've been working through what might be considered popular literature in the 18th century. That is, these were books that were downsized for sale, both to ship's captains, so they could see what they could learn about the coastline before they ran into the area, and for investors. The fascination of the investing public after the tulip mania and the things like that from the Dutch, in finding out where they were going to invest in these Dutch castles on the slave coast was quite interesting, so much so that they'd pay for books that illustrated it. But not huge quarto books or folio books. They wanted something that they could read and carry around. So the history of the book trade, I think, is fascinating for me here to learn about, and then trace back through to the source material on the cartography, who was drawing what about whom. And people like Ron Grimm have brought to our attention the fact that indigenous populations had their own mapping traditions.
Mhm.
And now we can start to digitize those and compare indigenous map visions of their own world with what the Europeans are envisioning on their side of the frontier.
Phoebe, Dorian asks in the chat, is there any way to see a copy of the survey of Narragansett Bay in verse? You mentioned it's Alden 56 from 1754.
Right now, no. Just because we're closed for COVID.
Yep. As soon as Phoebe gets back to her desk,
Yes. And we changed our it wasn't a gallery, an online gallery on our website, and we changed web hosts. I know it's a total snore, but so we have to rebuild all our galleries. So it will be available in the online galleries in the next couple months.
Well, that's exciting.
Yes.
Good, very exciting.
It's a beautiful piece. And
Well,
it's quite large. The survey is 42 by 33 centimeters.
oh my.
So, I mean, you can imagine the printing of it was quite an undertaking, and all that verse.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to know this. I will be able to sleep tonight knowing that there is a future seeing this. Thank you.
There is. Don't worry.
Well, Phoebe, that suggests a whole new realm too, that is possible now with 600 DPI scanning. I mean,
Yeah.
basically you could hold an international seminar on this one document, going through it sort of with all your attention to typeface, you know,
Right.
and you could share that through a shared screen in such a way that people who can never travel to the United States or to Rhode Island or ever find you down there in the boonies, as it were, can now look over your shoulder in a way that they could never look at the original. That is, they could never get up that close.
Yeah.
To analyze something that carefully. You wouldn't let them within that kind of range of the original document. But if you scan it in at 600 DPI, there's no reason why it couldn't be discussed in London, you know?
Yes, definitely. I like your worldwide vision.
Well, this COVID moment has forced it upon us in a way, because we've got to think about how we can use this virtual space to approximate what we knew in seminars. Well, what we're beginning to find out is that the new normal is going to blow away what we used to do in seminars, because now we can actually, on these African maps, for example, African colleagues, scholars from the University of Ibadan or the University of Dakar can sit in on a seminar to see maps they've never seen before in their lives, had no idea were ever recorded. And they know the place names.
Yeah.
We don't know what the heck they mean, but they can read them out to us as if it's significant because they know this. So it leads to a whole new kind of educational possibility.
Your mention of other places makes me, I can't help thinking of travel. And George, I have many questions for you, but mostly you had a slide showing 4 libraries, 2 of which I easily picked out, but the 2 at the top, one looked like Philadelphia, but the one on the top right, where was that library?
Well, I don't have the, I'm going to try to remember.
It was a very modern looking
what I
building.
depicted here. My goodness, give me a second here. Right. No, I'll tell you.
I thought it was the Beinecke.
Yeah, it was the Beinecke. It's the egg crate.
Yeah, one was the Beinecke. It was the outside of the Beinecke, and you can see the marble, I call them marble windows, but basically they're those marble slabs that let the light through. But they don't have the type of window UV coming through that would harm the books. That's the Rosenbach in the upper left in Philadelphia. And then, of course, the Houghton, and you're familiar with the one in the lower right.
Uh-huh.
I've never heard of the Beinecke.
Oh, others have, unfortunately.
So can I ask John a question about his extraordinary handmade book? John, what are your plans for it? You probably have thought of this.
Yes, I've thought of it. Well, as you could probably infer from what I did at the end of the book, it might be interesting to sort of insert it into a place where it looked like it had always been. So maybe something like that.
I mean, you're going to sneak into the afternoon, dead of night, John?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
John, I was wondering, are you talking as if you're going to try sneaking into the Athenaeum some night and then sticking it into a shelf and see how long it takes somebody to find it?
Or stick it out among the boobies.
How about in the Franklin? They've got a nice locked case.
One thought I had was it would be wonderful if more people could know about this journey you took to create this book, which is really a work of art. You know, we have this magazine I think many of us get called Fine Books and Collections, and I think Nick Basbanes is associated with that. I mean, a little story about that book and the journey that you went on to create it in a magazine like that, a periodical, I think would be very well received. I wonder if you should consider.
Well, I don't know if my book deserves that, but the story of the Howland Island story and what happened in 1955, and there's a lot of background beyond it. The 1955 article includes a sort of postscript by the head of ornithology at Harvard, James, now I'm blanking on his last name. And he was sort of, well, how do I say this? There is a theory that the 1955 submitter of the article created a hoax. Let me just say that flatly. And so that creates a whole, that just spins out into a whole nother story. So yeah, it deserves articles. I agree.
Dale, I can read a couple of comments from the chat if you like, as you asked.
Sure, go ahead. Thank you.
Todd Pattison made the point that on the cover of the Mars book, that it, by Percival Lowell, that the lettering looked like it might have been designed by Sarah Wyman Whitman. So, which is a great point and definitely something to investigate. And we know someone who's an expert on that, so we'll check with him. And Mary asked,
cover.
Yeah, I like that one. Mary asked about what I'm using to catalog the collection, and I started with Excel and then moved it into Google Sheets. So it's not a proper database, but I can search it and sort it, and I can do endless columns and create charts, and it's worked really well. And I've done about 550 books in that now, so beyond the nature collection. So it's pretty rudimentary, but flexible.
That works. And you might want to look into the open source Airtable. It's an open source database, and you can pretty easily import from either Excel and it allows you to do some more sophisticated linking, and it can take text and images and all kind of links much more easily than sometimes Google or Excel certainly does. But that's
well, Mary,
great
could you circulate some information about that? I mean, a lot of us are trying to figure out what to do.
You know what? Maybe, for the next newsletter, that might be a nice idea.
That'd be great.
Tools to help people at home. I'm gonna write that down right now.
Yeah. In fact, if you did a review of 2 or 3 of the different kinds of things that have been tried, in fact, if we had the comments about the spreadsheets too. That would be very helpful, because I've started things in different formats and usually get mad when they change the version of the software. I get into something, and by the time I'm into it, they say, "Oh well, that version doesn't work anymore. Forget it." And so I'm in the position of trying to backward translate or upward shift a lot of data, and would love to know what direction I should move in. And if there is an open source off the shelf piece that is as versatile as you just mentioned, I'd love to gravitate toward it.
All right, I am conscious of the fact that it's 7:25. So if you don't have any burning questions, I will let everyone get along with their evening. But I also want to say thank you yet again to our presenters. It's been a great evening.
Thanks, Dale.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dale.
Thanks.
Great session. Nicely engineered.
Yeah.
Well,
Happy holidays to everyone too.
Great work.
Good
We'll
night.
see you in the new
and
year.
thanks,
Good
Mary,
night.
too.
Thank you, Mary.
We should keep it up even after we get together again. I mean, this is the kind of thing, especially the Rhode Island poetic encounter with a document. You know, we could keep this as the preface to our gathering in real space, and then we
Yeah,
could
don't forget us down here.
get conversations going in real space.
Good night.
Thanks again, Dale.
Take care,
Thanks.
everybody.
And Mary. Bye-bye.